It is my honor and pleasure to welcome Chief Adkins to VCU. Chief Adkins, as some of you know, is a graduate of Adkins Junior College and also of VCU, where he received his Bachelor's of Science in Business Administration. He retired from the Commonwealth of Virginia as Chief Deputy Director of the Department of Human Resource Management, and from DuPont after 40 years of service. Chief Adkins has served as Principal Chief of the Chickahominy Indian Tribe since 2001. He has been a member of the Jamestown 400th Commemoration Commission, the 2019 Commemoration American Revolution, and currently serves on the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation Board of Trustees. That's a lot of words for a board. He served on the Charles City School Board for over 20 years. And my favorite part, he's a deacon and Sunday school teacher at Samaria Baptist Church. So he's basically earned retirement 3 times over, and yet here he is still teaching us. Please join me in welcoming Chief Stephen Adkins.
Good afternoon. Madam Provost, Governor Warren, tribal leaders, guests, and the various deans that I had the privilege of meeting just a few moments ago. And I would like to ask the tribal leaders who are heads of state if they would just stand. I thank VCU for its efforts to properly acknowledge this land relative to its indigenous inhabitants. I'm a proud VCU alum. Go Rams! And the significance of speaking here on land that was stolen from our forebears, it's not lost on me. In fact, it is very significant. The fact that November is a month set aside to honor Native American peoples and history brings even more significance to this time and place, but I must admit, I'm not a fan of Native American History Month, because were history taught as it should be, we wouldn't need a special month. If it's part of the ongoing lesson plans in classrooms from pre-K through PhD in history, we don't need the special time. So I want you to hold hands and push forward to ensure that textbooks teach history so we don't have to have a special month that's designed to tell people who Native Americans are. So I want you to help me on that. But the fact that this month is set aside does bring more significance to this time and place. It provides a small step forward in our effort to deconstruct, mind you, the contrived narrative about Native Americans that students are forced to learn in those brief periods of time and space indigenous history is taught in our classrooms. Governor Youngkin hosted a luncheon for the leaders of Virginia's indigenous tribes early in his tenure as governor. And I said, Governor Youngkin, I have one question for you today, and I hope you can answer it. Just one question. I said, I wanted you to assure me that the history of Virginia will be taught in classrooms across the Commonwealth. I emphasize there's no need to qualify the term history. If you teach history, it does the job. Life is all at once agony and ecstasy, comedy and tragedy. And if I leave at either of those components, then I'm not giving the students what they need to hear to get an accurate understanding of what was foundational and is foundational to the Commonwealth of Virginia, the United States notwithstanding. So, shortly after that conversation, there was a headline in the paper. It was in the Native News Online, published November 18, 2022. It says Virginia Education Department backtracks from labeling Native Americans as America's first immigrants. Superintendent of Public Instruction, Jillian Barlow, apologized for language in draft standards describing the ancestors of Virginia's indigenous peoples as America's first immigrants. Oh, well. Shortly after that, Superintendent of Public Instruction, no longer employed by the Commonwealth. So here I am today, sharing snippets of the history of the resilience and persistence of Virginia's indigenous tribes that has allowed them to survive the deliberate attempt by the dominant culture to eradicate them both literally and figuratively. We'll talk more about that. So where do I begin? Let's go back to the papal bulls that generated the infamous doctrine of discovery or manifest destiny. And I won't go through all of those with you, but suffice it to say, I'll give you a foundation that will let you know the damage that continues to harm, inflict harm upon native peoples even today, that doctrine of discovery. But Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dom Diversas on 18 June 1452. It authorized Alfonso V of Portugal to reduce any Saracens, Muslims, and pagans and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery. This facilitated the Portuguese slave trade from West Africa. The same Pope wrote the bull Romanus Pontifex on January 5th, 1455, to the same Alfonso. And then we end up with the papal bull that said any lands that Christians wanted to inhabit, it was their right, their God-given right, and they had the option to put people in perpetual servitude or even kill them if they didn't adhere to what the invaders had to say. So they really had a license to steal, a license to kill, a license to come forward and plunder and take land wherever and whenever they wanted. And if you look across the world, you'll see from places in the way out in the Pacific Ocean where we have our friends the Maoris who were victims of this. You go to India, you go through all of the Mideast, you'll see where the hands of the invaders wrought havoc at every step of the way. In 1493, Alexander VI, Pope Alexander VI, issued the bull Inter Cetera, stating one Christian nation did not have the right to establish dominion over lands previously dominated by another Christian nation, thus establishing the law of nations. Together, these papal bulls came to serve as the basis and justification for the doctrine of discovery. The global slave trade of the 15th and 16th centuries and the age of imperialism. And the source for this was doctrine of discovery.org. If folks want to fact check what I just shared with you. But I think it's good to set the stage. We faced strong headwinds from day one when the Europeans started exploring, conquering, stealing lands, and in many instances, raping and killing a lot of the women along the way. So, we'll talk a little bit more about the ramifications of the doctrine of discovery, the vestiges of which haunt indigenous peoples of the United States today. So with that background, we'll fast forward to May 14, 1607, which is the day the settlers came ashore at what is now known as Jamestown Island. They came armed with the doctrine of discovery, their God-given right to steal the land, weapons of war, and funds from European investors in systematic annihilation of the indigenous people of Chickahominy and the Turtle Island began. It began right away. In 1610, Lord Delaware ordered a militia to wipe out the Paspahegh tribe had the dubious distinction of living in closest proximity to Jamestown. He feared they would gained sufficient population and strength and numbers that they would overcome Jamestown. So the militia went out, they attacked the Passapartout, and they killed women and children alike. The chief, whose name was Winchapunky, thank you, Mom and Dad, for not naming me Winchapunky. but he wasn't there. But his wife was. They were told explicitly, do not bring any survivors back to Jamestown or any hostages. So along the way, the wife of the chief had 2 pre-adolescent boys in the boat with them. And the leader of the militia said, we were given explicit orders not to bring women hostages. So they threw those 2 children overboard. And the writer says they blew their brains out with a musket. Mind you, folks, this is 1610. This is a scant 3.5 years after the settlers landed in Jamestown. Fulfilling that right, they said God gave them. I think a miracle that ensued is that I, Stephen Adkins, I'm a Christian. And my tribe, and most of the tribes in the Commonwealth of Virginia, are Christian. So we heard the message despite the evil messengers that brought them to our shores. In my view, that is a miracle. So they took the wife of the chief ashore. But as they approached the Jamestown settlement, they said, if we take her back to the settlement, she would burn it state. So they decided to dispatch with her more humanely and ran her through with a sword. And I would say that later on, the leaders of Jamestown, when they would kill Native people, they would put them back to back so they wouldn't have to waste 2 bullets. They would shoot through the head of one to get the other one. And the history books don't talk about that. It's painful, and some of you may be offended to hear it today, but to put it in the base vernacular, you just got to suck it up, because I'm sharing the truth with you. So the carnage continued. In 1640 and 1614, the Chickahominy tribe engaged a treaty with the settlers, in which they agreed to provide 350 to 500 bowmen to the settlers in the event of an attack by the Spaniards, or even tribes that were hostile to the Chickahominy. And Wayne, that was hard for me to swallow. I didn't want to see them taking up arms against fellow tribes, but and there are family feuds, to wit the Hatfields and the Coors, so even families feud, and sometimes things get out of hand. But we signed that treaty. And I would ask you, if you don't agree with me, raise your hand. Don't you think that was history worthy? Don't you think it would have been good for people to understand and to read that first treaty? But no, you don't read it in history books, because the powers that be decided it wasn't worth putting in the textbooks. In 1619, the first English-speaking representative government was seated at Jamestown. And I say representative government tongue-in-cheek, because you weren't represented if you weren't a landowner, only white male. You weren't represented if you were female. So what I'm saying is representative government that was peopled only by males. So it's a far cry from real representation, but it was a first step. And while I have some issues with some things that occurred in the United States, there's no land of which I would rather be a citizen, next to being a citizen of the Chickahominy Indian Tribe. But with all the negative things, this is still the best place in the world to live, in my opinion. So this assembly was seated 1619. A scant 27 years later, they evicted the Chickahominy people from their native lands along Chickahominy Ridge, forced them down with their neighbors, Chief Brown, Chief Gray, in King William County. And all of the tribes had to stay on the reservation. If they chose to leave, if they given permission to leave, they had to be dressed in specific colored clothing. If they dared to venture out without having on the proper attire, the settlers were given permission to shoot them on sight. This too you don't read in history books, but it's a fact. It's a documented fact. So we will move to that reservation, as I said, a scant 27 years after the seating of the first English-speaking representative government. 1622, there was an uprising, and for years they called it the Massacre of 1622. And that's when O.P. Kankanu waged a very well thought out strategic attack on the settlers who had been just completely violating the treaties they had signed, saying that the land of the native people would be theirs forever. They would always have hunting and fishing rights. They could raise their gardens, do all those things that they needed to do to sustain themselves. But before the ink was dry, the treaty was broken. And Chief Powhatan had done some work trying to negotiate a reasonable settlement from the colonists, but to no avail. And O.P. Kankanu said, we're tired of it, we're going to fix this. And he sent Chanko to warn them. And the reason that I say he sanctioned Chanko to warn these people was because he was welcomed back to the reservation after he went and said, look, you're going to be attacked if you don't straighten up. So on a moonless night in 1622, there was a coordinated attack from the extreme tidal area down around Hampton Roads all the way up to eastern Henrico, actually and beyond, to Henricus, Henricus. And there was a simultaneous attack that night on all of those installations, from Berkeley Plantation in between and Flower 200, there was an attack. It was a moonless night. It was very successful. And we call it a successful military, can't think of the word, but anyway, but a very successful military attack on these people who just completely ignored the military campaigns, what I was trying to say, who completely ignored the treaty that they had agreed to obey. And the victory was short-lived. I'm sure the natives celebrated that victory for a while, but the hunger, the greed, the voracious appetite to take land just continued to grow. And to be sure, a lot of settlers were killed during that attack in 1622. But their numbers were immediately replenished by people who continued to come over to what they called the New World. Not the same thing for the natives, because we had a finite number of people. I would add that when the settlers landed in 1607, there were 35 to 40 tribes east of the fall line, the James River Fall line in Richmond, down to the eastern shore. And at the end of the 17th century, 9 out of 10 of the native people had perished. Some of it through disease, a lot of it through active warfare inflicted upon them by the settlers. 1646, the much heralded Bacon's Rebellion occurred, and if you walk in the Capitol today, you probably still see a picture of Bacon. I'd like to see it taken down. But he he wrought havoc on Native people. It was his mission to destroy Native Americans, and he was very successful in doing it. But how many of you read that in the history books? I'd like to get you an audience with Chief Ann Richardson. She's really become an expert on that history. But there are the things that we see every day where we're forced to kind of honor heroes who weren't our heroes. You know, my hero could have easily been characterized as Chief Powhatan, Chief O.P. Kankadoo, Chief Joseph, who famously said, "I will fight no more forever." Excuse the grammar, but he was speaking English as a second language. But it showed the passion he had for peace and the things that he would do to preserve that peace. In 1677, the treaty, ultimately called Articles of Peace and the Treaty of Middle Plantation, reduced writing many of the things that we needed to ensure our existence on this land that we call Chickahominy. And the tribes here today were signatories of that treaty. And that treaty was set aside over the ages, and it came to bear in a case that arose regarding some water rights in King William County. It was settled before it was adjudicated in court. I would have loved to have seen it adjudicated, because I think at that point the dynamics at bay were on our side. I believe the tribes would have prevailed. But we would deem sovereign subjects of the crown, which is a contradiction in terms. How can you be sovereign and subject? But that's what the treaty said. And it's significant to note that as years passed, after the colonies, those areas became the United States saw fit to keep the treaties, the trade treaties that the colonists had established with companies in Europe and elsewhere. But they also chose not to honor the treaty with its indigenous people. And we never went to war against the United States. Those folks, and we effectively kept the United States off the tribes out west for 200 and some years, which gave them time to get a lot of things done that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So we were hampered at the end by the fact that we had never taken up arms against the United States. And where I was going with that original thought was those tribes out west had engaged treaties after wars, to kind of settle that kind of conflict. And needless to say, the treaties weren't worth the ink that they were written on. I was, after speaking in Congress, in one of the testimonies early on, someone approached me all and said, "Why have treaties? It doesn't make sense. Here we are in the 21st century. Why do we have treaties?" I said, "I'm okay with doing away with the treaties. You give me back the 98% of the land mass you stole for us in exchange for these treaties, and we'll call it even. You can have the 2%. That didn't go over very well. But anyway, here we are. In 1750, the Chickahominy tribe began heading back home towards now what's called Chickahominy Ridge. And I think that's a miracle in itself, how our people could obtain land fee simple. Our modus operandi was to stay underground, to stay out of visibility so that we could protect our existence. But there must have been divine intervention, because our folks did start buying land and building homes in the middle of the 18th century. So that's where I like to say the arc of justice began. So if you look at 1750, and you fast forward to 1776, there was a document written The preamble says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And I must tell you, for years that Declaration of Independence, July the 4th, meant nothing to me, except a day off from work, and ice cream, and hot dogs, and fun at the old Chickahominy school with tribal citizens and citizens from other tribes would come and celebrate with us. But it had nothing to do with Old Glory, the flag, because we weren't who Thomas Jefferson was writing about when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. If you look at about the third paragraph from the bottom, it says the crown has incited these savages along the frontier whose methods of warfare don't distinguish, it doesn't discriminate between killing men, women, and children, all sexes. It gave me pause when I first read it, because that template for killing women and children was set in 1610 when Lord Delaware authorized the annihilation of the Pathfinder tribe. What a short memory we had. And I look at the Thomas Jefferson papers, which talked about the Monacan coming up and going to the burial grounds, the ossuary, the mound, where some of their citizens had been interred. And Jefferson said they just stayed for a while and observed and then left and went home. He also said with a certain amount of glee in the Jefferson papers that there are few, if any, Chickahominy citizens left. And that's the same one that in 1806 dispatched Lewis and Clark on a mission westward to take more land from native people. But still, I've been conditioned in school to look upon him as a founding father and to revere that image that's portrayed, even though it's contradictory to the actions that were going on when the Declaration of Independence was written. But if you look at that, what finally hooked me, folks, when it says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain rights. The Creator included me. Thomas Jefferson didn't include black and brown people, but the Creator did. So he made the mistake of pinning that, of writing it down. All men, women are created equal. And the right to pursue happiness perhaps can't be quantified, but the negative impact of not being able to pursue happiness is painfully obvious. In that last paragraph that I referenced, he said these savages whose long rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So then if you go forward a little more to the 1790s. In 1798, the Constitution of the United States was ratified by the 13th signature, so it became law, became the law of the land. And that starts out, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We see the arc of justice pinned in the right way in these words that were proclaimed. And within that Constitution, there's the much heralded Second Amendment that I think is grossly misinterpreted. It said, the Second Amendment says that well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But for me, and black and brown people, the right to bear arms was so they could kill those savages who would threaten to have the audacity to rise up and defend the land that was being taken from them. The Fourth Amendment should resonate with all of us. The right of the people to be secure in their persons. The right of you and I to go to bed at night in our domicile, our residence, without fear that somebody's going to come in under the authorities of the government to violate our privacy. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures. And I might add that in the 20th century, during Prohibition, some of the white population, dominant culture, people would come into their homes to get their contraband whiskey. And they said, this is against the Constitution. This is against the Fourth Amendment. And they gained some traction in that. And eventually that prohibition was eliminated. But not so much for black and brown people. That right against unlawful search and seizure still exists today. People are still being trampled on under the auspices of law to come into their homes, and in some places, you read headlines where people were actually killed when they went in their own home, and they're doing nothing illegal. And then the 14th Amendment, and I'll lift these up because they're near and dear to me. All persons born and naturalized in the United States, and should be dear to you, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges of communities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. All of us should value equal protection of the law, under the law. All of us should rise up and demand that this Constitution that was written, mind you, it didn't look at black and brown people when it was written. That wasn't part of that calculus when they put it together. But it's law, and it needs to be enforced that way. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Johnson versus McIntosh that the discovery rights of European sovereigns had been transferred to the new United States. And I would encourage you to go do some research and look at the trilogy. The three laws that were established by Chief Justice John Marshall, who's been heralded as one of the greatest legal scholars and practitioners in the history of the United States. But that doctrine of discovery was foundational to lots of the decisions that he rendered. And he said, it says, the colonists acquire territory on this continent under the principles of the right of discovery. Countries then unknown to all Christian people. He says, this is the right to take possession, notwithstanding the occupancy of the natives who were heathens, and at the same time admitting priority title of any Christian people. So it underscores what I said earlier. How could we embrace the Christian faith? And yet we did. And it's because we believed the message and disregarded the messenger. But Marshall's emphatic in adopting Christian discovery into U.S. law. He said the United States then have unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule which is civilized inhabitants now hold this country, which is civilized inhabitants now hold this country. And can you rightfully say that killing Indians at will, is that what the civilized people do? I would beg the question, who is civilized? The invaders or the prey? And we were in fact the prey. They hold and assert in themselves the title by which it was acquired. They maintain, as all others have maintained, that discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy, either by purchase or by conquest. And I'll end that with this. He said, as infidels Heathen and savages, they were not allowed to possess the prerogative belonging to absolute sovereign and dependent nations. The territory over which they wandered, which they used for their temporary and fugitive possession, was in respect to Christians deemed as if it were inhabited by brute animals. And that's the way we were looked upon in the eyes of Chief Justice John Marshall. But upon reflection, he was asked, to whom do you think this land really belongs? And he answered, from a divine perspective, it belongs to the native people. But I don't think they have the intellectual capacity to be good stewards of all of these vast possessions they had. And I like to share this one. It'd be great if he could be here in Richmond at the end of a heavy rainfall and drink a cup of water from the divine sewer overflow, and then tell me who was the better stewards. We've been here for millennia, and you could go to Jamestown and reach down in the water and pick up a handful of oysters, crabs. You could drink water from the Pamunkey River, which was, in my view, it was named the York River by the captains who completely disregarded the people who had been here for many, many years and had been good stewards over this land. In 1861 to 1864, the Civil War was raging. So as I look at that arc of justice, on November 19th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln said, 87 years ago, our forefathers brought forth in this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated that proposition that all men are created equal. He went on to say, we're gathered here today in this war to test whether that nation or any other nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. I pose the question now, with what's going on in the world, the United States notwithstanding, how long can we, as a free nation, so conceived endure? It's time to wake up and do what we need to do to restore that order that we deserve in this country. In the last quarter of the 19th century, Frank Speck and James Mooney, noted anthropologists, lived among at least 6 of the federal recognized tribes and presented a report to the government of the existence of the tribes and how they maintain their government structures. He also created what's called as the Mooney List in 1899. And those tribes that I know he visited included the Pamunkey, the Mattaponi, the Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, which at that time was part of the Chickahominy, Rappahannock, and other tribes I probably failed to mention, but he said these people clearly are natives. They have an established polity, they meet regularly, and they carry on their traditions. And he presented that report to the officials of the Department of Interior. During that same time period, 1901, the Chickahominy tribe reorganized to its present form of governance, which includes having an elected chief. I tell people we were like the people of Israel who looked around their neighbors. The people of Israel had a judge, and these other folks had kings. So Chickahominy said, we want a king too. So we elected chief the first time in 1901. I'm the 6th chief since then, and elections are every 4 years. But part of that, we also established Seminary Baptist Church, which will have its 125th anniversary in 2026. And things are going well. We were reveling in the fact that this report from Speck and Mooney was going to be published, and we finally get the federal recognition that we deserve. But another player came on the scene. His name was Walter Aspect Flickering. And under his pen, the Racial Integrity Act of the Commonwealth of Virginia kind of threw us under the bus. It said that any person with one drop of non-white blood was colored. In that context, when he said colored, he meant African American. And Pocahontas saved us. Some of her descendants said, well, that means these were the FFVs, and you know what it stands for. One day, in not mixed company, I'll tell you what it stands for to me. But they said, this means we're colored, and we're not, you know. So he backed up on it, much to his chagrin, and he said, now I'm going to have to let these mongrels who call themselves Indians exist, and before long, they will intermarry with whites and just bring down the intellectual capacity of the whites, because these people are intellectually deficient, and they don't have the mental aptitude of the white race. And people like Adolf Hitler praised what he had to say, and bad things happened. Indian women were actually rendered in a position where they couldn't bear children, they were sterilized. And lots of horrific things were done to Indians in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Racial Integrity Act says no person could get married in Virginia as an Indian. It said children couldn't be given Indian names. My good friend and brother Wayne Adkins, his mom and dad went to Washington, D.C. to be married. And the clerk of the House of Representatives joined them in marriage. And he would periodically write to the chief of the tribe and say, how's that nice young couple that I had the privilege to officiate their marriage? How are they doing? My mom and dad went to Washington, D.C. in 1935 to be married. And they put themselves at risk coming back home because they could have gone to jail for a year and fined significant dollars for having the audacity to marry and come back and live as an Indian couple. They're the things that we faced. So this Racial Integrity Act went into effect in 1924, and it's no coincidence that's the same year Indian tribes gained citizenship as citizens of the United States. And I could talk for days on that, because the reason that happened wasn't out of goodwill. It was another way to put us on the tax rolls and take away those things that belong to us as a result of treaties. So we won't go over that, but if you fast forward to 1934, the Bureau of Indian Affairs called the Office of Vital Records and said, there are tribes in Virginia that need to come on the rolls. This is 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, which would open the doors for the Pamunkey, the Mackinac, the Chickahominy, the tribes that I mentioned, to be admitted to the BIA at that point as Indian citizens. But that wasn't to be, because Blacker said there are no Indians in Virginia. 1936, Lou Shongo went to a school called Bacon High School. She got her high school diploma. She went on to get a college degree, to get a bachelor's degree. She came back to Charles City, Canada, and began to teach the Indian kids far beyond the capacity that we were able to go in school before then. We went about to the 8th grade. And from there, kids would go to Bacon College in Oklahoma to finish high school, and some stayed and went to college. And some never came back home, which I think was part of the calculus of the Commonwealth. And it happened because the kids got a one-way ticket to Oklahoma and scholarship to go to school there. Some of my brothers and sisters in the Pamunkey, Upper Mattapan, and other tribes went to Michigan and Philadelphia and other places that were more receptive to Indian communities, and where they were able to obtain in education, get a good job, and survive and prosper lots of times. But Chief Gray is one of those people who came back home and began to work with his tribe. Chief Kevin Brown underwent the same kind of thing. But Virginia didn't have a place for us. So that's part of the resilience. How am I doing? All right. So I'll just give you a few more snippets. In 1940s, the Chickahominy operated their own school, and other Indian tribes were doing the same thing. Some of our kids went to Bacon College, as I said. Some went to Oak Hill Academy here in Commonwealth. Some went to Blue Ridge College, Bluefield College. Some went to Pennsylvania, California, North Carolina. In 1951, we built our own school. We'd had a school before then, but this one was modern. It was a great building that we were proud for our kids to be educated in. And we had kids from Mattapan and from New Kent who bused over to Charles City to go to those schools. And we had people from Upper Mattapan who boarded with some of the families in Charles City so the kids could go to school. In 1952, students applied to Medical College of Virginia to go to nursing school. One was from the Eastern Chickahominy, one was from Chickahominy, in the persons of Lucille Stewart and Marie Stewart, the mother of Wayne Adkins. And they were told in no uncertain terms that you're not welcome here at MCV. And I hope that's part of the substantive effect that can arise out of this land acknowledgement. I hope that somewhere within Virginia Commonwealth University, there can be funds to allow Indian students to go to medical school without having to pay tuition. It's a few more things that I'll share with you, and I'll fast forward to the 70s. And a couple of things occurred that I'll say where that arc of justice came to rest in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. Many of you might not know about that, but that was a signal watershed moment for people of color and their ability to gain education in public schools. If I fast forward to 1964, the Voting Rights Act, which ended up in 1965, that opened the door for people like me to vote and remove the barriers, the artificially imposed barriers that precluded participation by Black and brown people. And you're seeing a lot of the things that are going on today to try to even undo that Voting Rights Act, which is still sorely needed to make sure that everyone has access to the polls. And it's hard for me in my feeble mind to understand why people don't want the masses to vote. I say the more the merrier. People need to exercise that right. I've been told that if the only thing on the ballot was voting for a dog catcher, Steve Adkins would be there voting, and guess what? That's the truth. In 1978, we began our quest for state recognition. That happened because my wife was the chair of the Title IV Indian Education Program, where kids came to school on Friday nights and on Saturdays to learn Indian culture, to learn those things in history that could help fortify them against the trash they were learning in schools regarding Native Americans. And we got a call from the Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction in Charles City County to say, in order to participate in this program, you must be state recognized or federally recognized. I said, well, sure, we're state recognized. When it turned out, the call went to the executive branch, and they were advised there were no state recognized tribes in the Commonwealth that had the audacity to include the Mattapan Pamunkey, who in fact had been on reservations since the mid-17th century. But we did a lot of work in that regard. We met for 4 years. One of the old lions in the House, Hardaway Morris, helped champion that bill, along with Elmo Cross. And we went through some very rigorous hearings in order to satisfy those criteria that were there. And we used the same criteria that the federal government does, 7 criteria. And we used all of those in our process. And after those 4 hard years, and sometimes folks, I want to throw up my hands and go home and say, heck with it. The questions were embarrassing, we didn't want to go through them, but we did. And we prevailed. In 1983, the Commission on Virginia Indians was established, and we gained state recognition. And that process was duplicated with enhancement and monitoring, very rigorous. It was changed somewhat in the last part of the 90s and in the early 2000s, and some of the folks just didn't stay the course and ended up getting recognition through an act of the House of Delegates in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But we stayed the course. It was uncomfortable, it was unpleasant, but we knew we had to have that background in order to go further. And it did bode well for us in our struggle for federal recognition. And the tribes that gained federal recognition in 2018 had dual processes. We pursued it legislatively and administratively, and in January 2018, the Chickahominy tribe took its administrative petition to the Office of Federal Acknowledgement. We were told, Chief, I told you, your tribe would be able to gain federal acknowledgement through the administrative program, administrative process. Same time, the Senate passed the bill approving the Thomasina Jordan Recognition Act in mid-January 2018. The House had approved it in May 2017. So when it passed the full Senate, it was sent to the President's desk. And I told Lee Fleming, Officer of Federal Acknowledgement, that whichever hit first is the one we would take. And it turned out to be the one the President signed into law on January 29, 2018, which produced Public Law 115-121. We began that process in the early 90s. We had sessions with the Technical Advisory Group, Technical Assistance Group from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to meet with us. And we went through the process, and I was told, you may not get federal recognition, but look at what you learned about yourself. I said, you got this wrong. We're teaching you about us. I know about myself. So, and ironically, when Wayne and myself went up to Lee Fleming's office in 2018, some of the same people that were on that technical assistance group were there. And I just kind of smiled when I saw them. Said, here we are. We didn't go for the consolation prize. We went for the real thing. Just before, in this album, the acknowledgement came just before 7 p.m. on January 29, 2018. My friends, the monkey gained federal recognition administratively in 2016, and you should have seen the people that came out of the cracks opposing it. People in California, people from here and yon, hither and yon, who were afraid that the monkey would come up, and how could they do it? Take some of the benefits away from them, but and they were getting a lot of press from non-natives who didn't want to see this tribe gain federal recognition. When I look at what we went through, we had a couple of detractors. John Warner adamantly opposed federal recognition for the Virginia tribe, stating that gaming will come to the Commonwealth, but I don't want Virginia Indians to be able to game, so I'll let you determine from that for yourself what that means. And then Frank Wolf in the House adamantly opposed it. So one Congress it would pass the House, only to be stymied in the Senate. Then the next time it passed the Senate, to be stymied in the House. We actually went to Virgil Good's office, and he wouldn't let us in. He said, I'm not going to even talk to you. All you want to do is game, and I'm not going to talk to you. And one of the guys that was with me, I had to hold him back because he would have been in jail otherwise. But But Virgil Good made that statement, and he says, I won't even talk to you. And I'll tell you folks, he was an elected representative who was paid for. His job was paid for by the citizens. In 1999, we were told by Lee Fleming of the Office of Federal Acknowledgement that I think some of your tribes will gain federal acknowledgement as sovereign nations, but many of you here today won't live long enough to see it. And that prophecy came through. My dear friend, Chief Lawrence Adkins, whose day had passed in the interim. He didn't get to see the results of the labors that we had exerted in this process. I'm going to close with just a couple of things that I saw this weekend. This weekend there was a commentary in the Richmond Times-Dispatch written by author and columnist Laura Bergman. Said more than meets the eye. There's more than meets the eye to Thanksgiving. And she talked about the travails and hardships that people endured getting ready for Thanksgiving back in the 17th century. No water, no running water, no electricity, blah, blah, blah. And this was the dominant culture, calling it the first Thanksgiving. I took umbrage right away. Native people have been celebrating, giving thanks for millennia, thanking God for our spring planting and for our fall harvest. So my comment to Laura Bergman is that much more than meets the eye was there for you. And then there was another article that appeared and cited George Will wrote an op-ed. And he said that following orders from Congress in May 1779, George Washington ordered the total destruction of Native American settlements. It will be essential to ruin the crops now in the ground and prevent them from planting more. Now, this is after many Native Americans fought in the Revolutionary War hoping for humane treatment in a post-war environment. There was a letter that Rabbi David S. Asher wrote in the Times-Dispatch, where he was citing George Washington for writing a letter to the Congregational Synagogue in Rhode Island expressing the religious freedom enshrined in the U.S. Constitution and dispelling concerns regarding freedom of religion beyond Christendom. And here's what he said, I quote, declaring to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. This hypocritical declaration from an owner of slaves and a disparager of American Indians. This is another one of the founding fathers that Native people are supposed to genuflect to. Folks, I'm sorry, I can't. And I'm probably the chiefest of hypocrites, but I'm not going to say in one statement. To bigotry, no sanction. To persecution, no assistance. While I am waging war on Native people, while I own slaves and they're subject to the same inhumane treatment that slaves were across what is now the United States then. So how did we get here? How did we gain federal acknowledgement? How did we as tribes stay together? Some people flee from hardships. Some people knuckle down, coalesce, and fight it together. And that's what these Indian tribes did for well over 100 years, or 150, longer than that. These tribes have gotten together every year for either a powwow or a church-related meeting. The Pamunkey reached out to the Chickahominy and said, folks, you need to establish your school. You need to put more discipline in the meetings because you do not want to lose your identity as Native people. So, Chief Brown, I commend you and the Pamunkey for taking that leadership. And here we are. Other people would have run. other people would have hidden. But through this adversity, the tribes gained strength. And we held hands with a resolute determination that we would conquer those ghosts that continue to haunt us, that we would stay together. And as Paul said, we'd press on toward the goal, toward the prize, toward the goal, which calls us heaven. We'd press on toward the prize of the high calling of Jesus Christ. And folks, that's what we did. The being to whom the doctrine of discovery ascribed the permission to come and kill us and take our land. That same God we pray to every day and understand that it's His will that none should perish. I thank you for your time and attention, and we welcome any questions you might have.